Sometimes the greatest treasures are found by those the world overlooks. Sometimes a man's quiet faith leads him exactly where he needs to be, even when everyone else thinks he's lost his mind. Ezekiel Yoder was that kind of man. For 43 years, this simple Amish farmer worked his land with nothing but his hands and his beliefs. When he walked into town and announced he'd bought the old Brennan cabin for $50, folks laughed out loud. That cabin was a rotting mess that hadn't seen a soul in 20 years. But Ezekiel saw something others missed. When he pried open a loose floorboard, he found a fortune in stolen gold that had been hidden for decades. Now the same people who mocked him want what he found. But will this discovery save his community or destroy everything he holds dear? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rooster's crow pierced the Pennsylvania dawn like it had every morning for the past 43 years, but this morning felt different to Ezekiel Yoder. He sat on the edge of his narrow bed, his calloused hands wrapped around the leather-bound family Bible that had belonged to his father and his father's father before him. Between the worn pages, pressed flowers from his late wife Sarah's garden still held their faded beauty, purple violets, yellow daisies, and the tiny white blooms from their apple tree that she'd loved so dearly. 5 years had passed since Sarah died, trying to bring their first child into this world. 5 years since he'd buried them both beneath the old oak tree behind the house, their matching headstones simple and plain as their faith demanded. The grief had settled into his bones like winter cold, never quite leaving, always there to remind him of what might have been. Ezekiel rose slowly, his joints protesting the October chill that seeped through the wooden walls. At 43, he felt older than his years, worn down not just by hard labor, but by the weight of solitude. He dressed in his everyday clothes, black wool pants, white cotton shirt, and dark suspenders, the uniform of his people that marked him as separate from the English world, beyond their community's borders. Outside, his breath formed small clouds in the crisp air as he made his way to the barn. The familiar routine of milking his 3 Holstein cows usually brought him peace, but lately, even these simple tasks felt hollow. His neighbors often remarked on his reliability, his steady presence at barn raisings and church services, his willingness to help any family in need, but inside, Ezekiel wrestled with a restlessness that seemed to grow stronger each day. "Good morning, Bessie," he murmured to his oldest cow, settling onto the 3-legged stool his grandfather had carved from hickory wood. The rhythmic sound of milk hitting the tin pail usually calmed his mind, but today his thoughts wandered to places they shouldn't go, to questions about purpose and meaning that his faith should have settled long ago. The sound of buggy wheels on gravel announced his first visitor of the day. Through the barn door, he watched Rebecca Miller guide her chestnut mare up his lane. Rebecca was a widow herself, her husband taken by pneumonia 3 winters past, leaving her to manage the adjacent farm with her elderly father. At 36, she possessed a quiet strength that reminded him of Sarah, though her brown hair held auburn highlights that caught the morning sun differently. "Ezekiel," she called, securing her horse to the hitching post. "I hope you don't mind the early visit, but I wanted to speak with you before heading to market." He emerged from the barn with his milk pail, noting how her dark blue dress and black bonnet made her eyes seem even more vibrant. "You're always welcome here, Rebecca. What's troubling you?" She approached slowly, her hands clasped in front of her. "It's about what Bishop Stoltzfus mentioned after service yesterday, about your recent behavior." Ezekiel set down the milk pail and leaned against the fence rail. Bishop Eli Stoltzfus had been their spiritual leader for over 20 years, a man of unwavering conviction who viewed any deviation from traditional ways with deep suspicion. At 72, he'd seen too many young men drawn away by the temptations of the English world. What exactly did he say? Rebecca's cheeks flushed slightly. He's concerned about your frequent trips to town, your conversations with the English shopkeepers. He fears you're becoming too interested in worldly matters. The irony wasn't lost on Ezekiel. His trips to McCreary's general store had indeed increased lately, but not for the reasons the bishop suspected. Thomas McCreary, the store's talkative owner, served as the unofficial keeper of local history and gossip. Through him, Ezekiel had learned about families who'd once farmed this land, about the old days when Amish and English communities mingled more freely. "I appreciate his concern," Ezekiel said carefully, "but a man needs to understand his place in the world, don't you think?" Rebecca stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Is this about Sarah? About what happened?" The question hung in the air between them like morning mist. Sarah's death had shattered something fundamental in Ezekiel's faith, though he'd never spoken of it aloud. How could God, who was supposed to be merciful and loving, take away the one person who'd brought light into his carefully ordered world? "Perhaps," he admitted, "I find myself wondering about things I used to accept without question." "And what sort of things?" Before he could answer, another buggy appeared on the lane, this one driven by Bishop Stoltzfus himself. The elderly man's stern expression suggested this wasn't a social call. "Rebecca, Ezekiel," the bishop nodded as he climbed down from his buggy with the careful movements of advanced age. His white beard reached nearly to his chest, and his pale blue eyes held the intensity of a man accustomed to unquestioned authority. "Bishop Stoltzfus," Rebecca said, offering a respectful curtsy. "We were just discussing the beautiful morning God has blessed us with." The old man's gaze shifted between them, measuring, evaluating. "Indeed. I trust you were also discussing the importance of staying focused on our community's spiritual well-being, rather than being distracted by outside influences." Ezekiel felt heat rise in his chest. "If you have something to say to me directly, Bishop, I'd appreciate hearing it plainly." "Very well." Stoltzfus stepped closer, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent shepherding reluctant souls. "Thomas McCreary tells me you've been asking questions about the old Brennan place, that abandoned cabin deep in the woods that's been rotting for 20 years. I asked about its history, yes, and why would a faithful Amish man concern himself with such worldly matters?" Ezekiel looked past the bishop toward the rolling hills that stretched to the horizon, painted in the gold and crimson of autumn. Somewhere out there, hidden among the trees, sat the cabin that had captured his imagination for reasons he couldn't fully explain. "Sometimes God speaks to us in ways we don't immediately understand," he said quietly. Bishop Stoltzfus's eyebrows rose. "And you believe God is speaking to you about a derelict English cabin?" "I believe God doesn't waste anything, not even forgotten places." Rebecca shifted uncomfortably between the two men, clearly sensing the tension building like thunder before a storm. "Perhaps we should—" "No," the bishop raised his hand. "This is exactly the kind of thinking that leads our young people astray. We have everything we need within our community, within our faith. Seeking meaning in abandoned English buildings is foolishness. With respect, Bishop, you weren't there when I walked past that place last week. You didn't feel what I felt." "And what exactly did you feel, Ezekiel?" The question demanded honesty, even if that honesty challenged everything his community believed about staying separate from the outside world. "I felt called to it, like something important was waiting there. For a long moment, the only sounds were the gentle lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the cornstalks." Finally, Bishop Stoltzfus shook his head sadly. "Grief can play tricks on a man's mind, son. What you felt was loneliness, nothing more. The answer to that loneliness isn't found in English ruins, but in renewed commitment to your faith and community. And if I disagree," the old man's expression hardened, "then you'll need to decide what matters more. Your place among God's chosen people, or chasing after worldly fantasies that will only lead you away from salvation." After the bishop left, Rebecca lingered, her expression troubled. "He means well. You know, I know." Ezekiel picked up his milk pail and started toward the house. "That doesn't make him right." She fell into step beside him. "What will you do?" "I'm going to town this afternoon. Thomas McCreary mentioned that the Brennan place might be up for sale soon." Rebecca stopped walking. "Ezekiel, you can't be serious." He turned to face her, seeing his own uncertainty reflected in her worried eyes. "I've been alone in this house for 5 years, Rebecca. Every morning I wake up to silence. Every evening I eat supper by myself. Every night I pray to a God who sometimes feels very far away. If there's even a chance that cabin holds some kind of answer, some kind of purpose, then I have to know. And if it's just a rotting building with nothing inside but decay and disappointment, then at least I'll have tried to find something. Beyond this endless routine of emptiness." The words hung between them, more honest than he'd intended. Rebecca reached out and touched his arm gently. "You're not alone, Ezekiel. You have friends here, people who care about you." "I know," he said again, but they both understood that friendship, however genuine, couldn't fill the hollow place in his chest where purpose used to live. That afternoon, as promised, Ezekiel hitched his horse to the buggy and drove the 3 miles to town. McCreary's General Store occupied a prime corner lot on Main Street, its wooden sign creaking in the autumn breeze. Inside, shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, packed with everything from canned goods to farming supplies. To bolts of cloth. Thomas McCreary looked up from his ledger as the bell above the door announced Ezekiel's arrival. At 65, McCreary had the soft appearance of a man who'd spent more time behind a counter than behind a plough, but his eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who understood that information was often more valuable than merchandise. Well, McCreary grinned, showing teeth stained brown from years of coffee and tobacco. "If it isn't our mysterious Amish friend, come to hear more stories about the old days." "Actually, I came to ask about purchasing property." McCreary's eyebrows shot up. "Property? Don't tell me you're looking to expand your farm. Most of your people are selling these days, what with the young folks heading west. Not farmland, the Brennan cabin." The store owner's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "Now hold on there, Ezekiel. That place has been abandoned for 2 decades. It's probably not even structurally sound anymore. Who would I need to talk to about buying it?" McCreary scratched his graying beard. "Well, I suppose that would be the county clerk's office. Old Henrik Brennan died without a proper will, and his son Caleb disappeared right around the same time. County's been holding the deed in trust, waiting for someone to claim it or pay the back taxes. How much would those taxes amount to? Can't say for certain, but probably not more than $50. Place isn't worth much in its current condition. $50 represented nearly 2 months of careful saving for a man who lived as simply as Ezekiel, but the amount felt manageable. More importantly, it felt like a sign. "Is there anything else I should know about the property?" McCreary leaned against the counter, his voice dropping to the conspiratorial tone he used for his best. "Stories. The Brennans were Irish immigrants, came here in the 1850s. Henrik was a skilled carpenter, built that cabin with his own hands using timber from his own land. They had a son, Caleb, and for a while things seemed to go well for them." "What happened?" "Nobody knows for sure. Around 1875, Henrik started acting strange, nervous, jumpy, like he was expecting trouble. He'd come into town for supplies, but wouldn't stay to chat like he used to. Then one day, both he and Caleb just vanished. Neighbors found the cabin empty, no sign of struggle, no note, nothing, and nobody ever heard from them again. Not a word. Sheriff at the time figured they'd moved on to try their luck somewhere else. Maybe California or Oregon territory. Happens, more often than you'd think. Families just pack up and disappear when times get hard." Ezekiel thanked McCreary for the information and drove to the county courthouse, an imposing brick building that housed the administrative heart of their rural community. The clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, confirmed what McCreary had said about the taxes and legal status of the property. "You're sure you want that particular piece of land? the clerk asked, sliding the deed papers across his desk. "It's pretty isolated, and from what I understand, the cabin's in terrible shape." "I'm sure." "Well, it's your money. $50. In cash, and the property transfers to you immediately." Ezekiel counted out the bills slowly, each one representing hours of labor and careful budgeting. As he signed his name to the deed, he felt a mixture of excitement and terror, the same feeling he'd experienced as a young man when he'd first asked Sarah's father for permission to court her. The ride home passed in a blur of autumn colors and racing thoughts. What would he tell Rebecca? How would he explain this decision to Bishop Stoltzfus? More importantly, what would he actually do with a rotting cabin in the middle of nowhere? As his farm came into view, he noticed another buggy in his yard, Sheriff Jake Morrison's official vehicle. Morrison was one of the few English lawmen who'd earned the respect of the Amish community through his fair dealing and genuine concern for all the county's residents. The sheriff emerged from the buggy as Ezekiel approached, his weathered face grave. "Afternoon, Ezekiel. I heard from Thomas McCreary that you might be interested in the old Brennan place." "I just bought it, actually." Morrison's expression grew even more serious. "Then I need to tell you something. We've had reports of someone prowling around that property lately. Might be drifters looking for shelter, might be something else. Either way, you should be careful going out there alone." "What kind of reports?" "Couple of hunters saw smoke coming from the area last week, and old Mrs. Patterson swears she heard voices in the woods near there. Could be nothing, but in my experience, abandoned places sometimes attract the wrong sort of attention." Ezekiel nodded slowly. "I appreciate the warning, Sheriff. Just be smart about it. That cabin's been empty a long time, long enough for all sorts of stories to grow up around it. Some folks think it's cursed, others think it's hiding secrets. Truth is it's probably just an old building that needs to be torn down." But as Sheriff Morrison drove away and Ezekiel unhitched his horse, he found himself thinking about those stories and secrets. Something had drawn him to that place with a pull stronger than logic or caution. Tomorrow, he decided, he'd go see exactly what $50 had bought him. The evening passed quietly with a simple supper of bread, cheese, and vegetables from his garden. As darkness fell, he sat by the oil lamp reading his Bible, the pressed flowers from Sarah's garden catching the golden light. But even the familiar words couldn't quiet the anticipation building in his chest. Somewhere in the woods, his cabin waited. Ezekiel had come looking for purpose. Instead, he'd found mystery, treasure, and a man who was supposed to be dead. The storm outside was nothing compared to the tempest he sensed was about to engulf his quiet life. Thunder crashed overhead, and rain began pattering on the cabin roof. Whatever conversation they were about to have would need to happen here, in this place where Henrik Brennan had hidden his secrets and attempted his redemption. Caleb's laugh was bitter. "That's what we wanted people to think. Sometimes a man needs to disappear for a while, especially when staying might put innocent folks in danger." "I thought you'd disappeared," Ezekiel said carefully. Caleb Brennan, the son who was supposed to have vanished along with his father in 1875. The boy from the photograph, now grown into a man of perhaps 50 years. Ezekiel felt the weight of the gold coins in his pocket and the metal box in his satchel, suddenly aware that this meeting might be more complicated than a simple case of mistaken identity. The man stepped across the threshold, removing his hat, to reveal thick hair streaked with silver. "Name's Caleb Brennan. This cabin belonged to my father, Henrik. I've been wondering when someone would finally claim it." "I am." "And you are?" "You're the Amish fellow who bought this place," the stranger said. It wasn't a question. The man standing on the porch was indeed tall and broad, with graying hair and weathered features that spoke of a life spent largely outdoors. His clothes were English: wool trousers, cotton shirt, leather vest, but well worn and practical rather than fashionable. Most importantly, his eyes held no hostility, only a mixture of curiosity and what might have been relief. The voice carried a slight accent, possibly Irish, and belonged to someone middle-aged or older. After a moment's hesitation, Ezekiel stepped into view of the open doorway. "I know someone's in there. I saw your buggy hidden back in the trees. No point in hiding." Ezekiel pressed himself against the wall beside the door, hardly daring to breathe. The footsteps paused at the threshold, and he heard the soft squeak of the door latch being tested. Then, unexpectedly, a voice called out, not threatening, but cautious. He quickly rewrapped the letter and photograph, returned them to the metal box, and slipped the box into his canvas satchel. The coins went into his pocket as the footsteps reached the cabin's porch. Through the grimy window, he saw a shadow moving past, someone tall and broad-shouldered, wearing dark clothes and a wide-brimmed hat. The letter was signed Henrik Brennan and dated September 15, 1875, just weeks before he and his son had vanished. But before Ezekiel could read further, a sound from outside froze his blood. Footsteps, heavy boots crunching through dead leaves, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who knew exactly where they were going. To whoever finds this record of my sins and my attempts at redemption, know that I have tried to make amends for the terrible mistakes of my past. But it was the letter that made his hands tremble as he unfolded it. Written in brown ink that had faded but remained legible, it began simply, "The canvas pouch contained 3 gold coins, each about the size of a silver dollar, but heavier and with different markings than any currency Ezekiel had seen. The metal caught the dim light filtering through the cabin windows, glowing with the unmistakable richness of genuine gold. The photograph drew his attention first. The bearded man bore a strong resemblance to the carving initials HB. This had to be Henrik Brennan, his wife, and their son Caleb. They were posed formally, as was customary for such portraits, but their eyes held warmth and hope. They looked like a family with plans for the future, not people preparing to disappear without explanation. Inside the box, wrapped in oiled leather that had protected them from moisture and decay, lay several items that made Ezekiel's heart race. First was a folded piece of paper covered in faded ink, a letter written in a careful, educated hand. Second was a small canvas pouch that clinked softly when he lifted it. Third was a daguerreotype photograph showing a family group. A bearded man in his 30s, a woman about the same age, and a boy of perhaps 10 years. Working the blade of his pocket knife into the gap, Ezekiel managed to lift one end of the plank. Beneath it lay a metal box, roughly the size of a family Bible, its surface green with verdigris, but its latch still functional. The rusted key fit perfectly. The answer came as he knelt to examine the floor more carefully. Near the far wall, partially hidden beneath decades of accumulated dust and debris, one of the wide planks appeared to be loose. The wood around its edges showed signs of having been pried up repeatedly, and when he pressed down on it, the board shifted slightly. Thunder rumbled in the distance, reminding Ezekiel that a storm was approaching. He should return home before the roads became impassable, but something about the cabin demanded further exploration. He pulled the rusted key from his pocket and examined it more closely. Its size and shape suggested it opened something substantial. But what Henrik Brennan? The cabin's original owner had been here in 1875, the same year he and his son had supposedly vanished without a trace. But if Henrik had disappeared, who had been living in this cabin since then? And why had they left it equipped as if they might return at any time? Near the fireplace, one carving was deeper and more elaborate than the others. It showed what appeared to be a cross, but surrounded by a circle and with strange marks radiating outward like the rays of the sun. Below it, scratched in block letters, were the initials HB and a date, 1875, carved into the logs at shoulder. Height. Someone had etched a series of marks, not random scratches, but deliberate symbols that seemed to follow a pattern. Some looked like letters or numbers, others resembled simple pictures, a tree, a bird in flight, what might have been a mountain peak. They covered nearly every wall, as if whoever made them had been trying to communicate something important. Ezekiel moved deeper into the cabin, his boots echoing on the wide plank floor. A narrow staircase led to what must be a sleeping loft above, while a doorway to his left opened onto a smaller room that had probably served as a kitchen. But it was the main room that held his attention, particularly the walls. A simple table sat in the center of the main room, its surface scarred but clean. 2 chairs flanked it, and on the far wall shelves held an assortment of items: tin plates, mason jars, even a few books wrapped in oiled cloth to protect them from moisture. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and though cold now, it showed signs of recent use. Fresh kindling was stacked nearby, and the ashes in the firebox looked no more than a few weeks old. The door opened with a prolonged creak that sent several bats fluttering from the rafters above. Inside, shafts of pale sunlight slanted through dirty windows, illuminating a scene of controlled decay. Unlike the chaos he'd expected, the cabin's interior suggested someone had lived there much more recently than the official story indicated. The key came free with considerable effort, its surface pitted with corrosion, but its basic shape still intact. It was larger than a typical house key, more like something that might open a strongbox or chest. Ezekiel turned it over in his palm, wondering who had hidden it there and why. He climbed the porch steps carefully, testing each board before trusting it with his full weight. The front door was secured with a simple wooden latch, the kind his own people used on barns and storage sheds. As he reached for it, something metallic caught his eye in the doorframe. A rusted iron key, wedged tightly between the wood and the stone foundation. But as Ezekiel approached more closely, he noticed details that didn't match Thomas McCreary's description of 20 years of abandonment. The windows, though grimy and cracked, were still intact. The door, while weathered, hung straight on its hinges. Most telling of all, a faint path led to the cabin's entrance. Not the random trails made by deer and smaller animals, but the deliberate track of someone who'd visited this place recently. The Brennan cabin emerged from the forest, like something from a half-remembered dream. Its log walls darkened by weather and time, its stone chimney crumbling at the edges. What had once been a small front porch now sagged dangerously, supported by posts that had rotted nearly through. Moss covered the cedar shake roof so completely that it looked more like a natural hill than a human dwelling. Then he saw it. Ezekiel secured his horse to a sturdy birch tree and continued on foot, pushing through underbrush that hadn't seen human visage in years. The forest floor was thick with decomposing leaves that released the rich scent of earth and decay with each step. Somewhere ahead, he could hear the gentle babble of a creek, and beyond that, the hammering of a woodpecker echoing through the trees. The ride to the Brennan property took him along back roads he rarely traveled, through dense woods that seemed to swallow sound and sunlight alike. Ancient oaks and maples formed a canopy overhead, their remaining leaves rustling with secrets only the wind could understand. After nearly an hour of steady travel, he spotted a narrow track branching off. To the right, barely more than deer path, overgrown with brambles and saplings. Dawn came grey and cold, with heavy clouds promising rain before evening. Ezekiel finished his morning chores with unusual haste, his mind already focused on the journey ahead. He packed a simple lunch of bread and dried meat, added his father's carpenter tools to a canvas satchel, and hitched his most reliable horse to the buggy. The rain drummed harder against the cabin roof as the 2 men faced each other across the small room. Caleb Brennan moved to the fireplace, his movements practiced and familiar, as if he'd done this countless times before. From a tin box hidden behind loose stones, he produced dry kindling and soon had a small fire crackling in the grate. "You'll be wanting explanations," Caleb said, settling into one of the wooden chairs. "And I suppose after all these years, it's time someone heard the whole truth." Ezekiel remained standing, his hand instinctively moving to the canvas satchel that contained the metal box. "Before you begin, I should tell you that I found something hidden under the floorboards. Something that belonged to your father. Caleb's eyes sharpened. The strong box with the letter and the coins? You knew about it. I helped him hide it. Caleb leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. What I'm about to tell you goes against everything folks in town believe. About my family. Henrik Brennan wasn't just a simple carpenter who disappeared. He was a man trying to outrun his past, and ultimately a man who died trying to make things right. The fire cast dancing shadows on the cabin walls as Caleb began his story. Henrik Brennan had indeed come to Pennsylvania in the 1850s, but he hadn't been fleeing poverty in Ireland. He'd been running from justice, wanted for his involvement in a series of stagecoach robberies that had plagued the Western Territories during the gold rush years. He wasn't proud of what he'd done, Caleb continued, but he was young and desperate, and he fell in with the wrong men. When he finally realized the blood on his hands would never wash clean, he took his share of the stolen gold and came east to start over. And your mother died when I was 12, never knowing the truth about his past. De thought he could bury Henrik the outlaw and live as Henrik the carpenter. For a while it worked. Ezekiel pulled the metal box from his satchel and set it on the table between them. Then what happened in 1875? Caleb's face hardened. The past caught up with us. One of his old partners tracked him down, demanding his share of the gold. But Dar had spent most of it over the years. On this land, on building the cabin, on providing for our family. When he couldn't pay what was demanded, threats were made. What kind of threats? Against me, against innocent folks in town who'd shown us kindness. Dar realized that staying would only bring violence to people who didn't deserve it. The pieces began falling into place in Ezekiel's mind. So you both disappeared to protect the community, in a manner of speaking. Caleb stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the storm-darkened forest. A door sent me away first, told everyone I'd gone to work on a farm in Ohio. Then he staged his own disappearance, making it look like he'd packed up and left in the middle of the night. But he didn't actually leave. No. He came back here to this cabin and spent his final years living like a hermit. He was dying of consumption, had been for months. Those last few years, he used what strength he had left, trying to track down the families of the people his old gang had robbed, trying to make restitution. Ezekiel opened the metal box and carefully unfolded Henrik's letter. In the firelight, he could make out more of the faded words. I have tried to make amends for the terrible mistakes of my past, but death approaches before my work is finished. The gold hidden beneath this cabin represents stolen wealth that rightfully belongs to others. I pray that whoever finds this record will have the wisdom and courage to complete what I could not. He hid more gold, Ezekiel said, looking up from the letter. Caleb nodded gravely. Much more. What you found in that box was just a sample, a way to prove to whoever discovered his letter that he was telling the truth. The real treasure is buried elsewhere on this property. A new voice cut through the rain and their conversation. A woman's voice calling from outside. Ezekiel? Ezekiel, are you in there? Through the window they could see Rebecca Miller approaching the cabin, her dark cloak soaked with rain and her face pale with worry. She led her horse carefully through the mud, calling his name again. I should have known you'd follow me, Ezekiel muttered, moving to the door. Rebecca stepped onto the porch, shaking water from her cloak. Her eyes widened when she saw Caleb Brennan standing by the fireplace. Rebecca Miller, Ezekiel said awkwardly. I'd like you to meet Caleb Brennan. Brennan? Her voice carried a mixture of confusion and fear. But I thought everyone said the Brennans disappeared years ago. Caleb stepped forward, offering a slight bow. Miss Miller, I knew your father when you were just a little girl. You probably don't remember me. Recognition dawned slowly in Rebecca's eyes. You were the boy who helped with our barn raising back in '68. You and your father. But that means I've been living a lie for 20 years, Caleb finished quietly. Ezekiel quickly explained what he'd learned. showing Rebecca the contents of the metal box while carefully omitting the details about additional hidden treasure. As he spoke, he watched her face cycle through disbelief, understanding, and finally deep concern. "This is dangerous, isn't it?" she asked when he finished. "If there are people still looking for stolen gold, if there are men willing to threaten innocent families." "The men who threatened my father are long dead," Caleb assured her. "I made sure of that over the years. But Miss Miller is right about the danger. Gold has a way of bringing out the worst in people, even good people who think they have the best of intentions." Thunder crashed directly overhead, making all three of them jump. In the brief silence that followed, they heard a new sound, the approach of multiple horses moving fast despite the storm. Caleb moved quickly to the window, his body tensing. 3 riders, maybe 4, moving like they know exactly where they're going. "Friends of yours?" Ezekiel asked. "I don't have friends," Caleb replied grimly, then turned to Rebecca. "Miss Miller, I need you to take your horse and ride straight back to town. Find Sheriff Morrison and tell him that Marcus Thornfield has come calling." "Who's Marcus Thornfield?" "Someone who's been asking questions about this property for months. Someone who thinks old gold should belong to whoever's smart enough to find it." Rebecca looked from Caleb to Ezekiel, her face set with determination. "I'm not leaving you here alone." "Rebecca," Ezekiel began. "No." Her voice carried an authority that surprised both men. "If there's trouble coming, we face it together." Outside, the sound of horses grew louder. Through the rain-streaked window, they could see lantern light moving through the trees. The riders had spread out, surrounding the cabin in a careful pattern that suggested military training or long experience with such operations. Caleb moved to the fireplace and began quickly dismantling his kindling box, revealing a hidden compartment that contained a well-maintained rifle and ammunition. "That letter your father left mentioned something about completing his work," he said to Ezekiel, while checking the weapon. "I hope you're prepared for what that might require." Ezekiel's hand moved to the simple carpenter's plane he'd brought from home, the same type of tool Henrik Brennan would have used to build this cabin with honest labor. The irony wasn't lost on him that a tool meant for creation might now be needed for protection. A voice called out from the darkness, cultured and confident despite the storm. "Good evening, friends. I apologize for calling at such an inconvenient hour, but I believe we have matters of mutual interest to discuss." Caleb positioned himself beside the window, rifle ready. "That's Thornfield. He's got a way with words, but don't let that fool you. The men with him aren't here for conversation." "What does he want?" Rebecca whispered. "Same thing every greedy man wants," Caleb replied. "Something that doesn't belong to him." Through the rain, they could see a figure approaching the cabin, tall, well-dressed even in the storm, moving with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. Marcus Thornfield stopped just short of the porch, close enough to be heard, but far enough to avoid any sudden moves from inside. "Mr. Brennan," Thornfield called out, confirming that he knew exactly who was in the cabin. "I know you're listening, and I believe you have our new property owner with you. Mr. Yoder, isn't it? Perhaps we could discuss this situation like civilized men." Ezekiel felt Rebecca's hand grip his arm. "He knows who you are," she whispered urgently. "Course he does," Caleb muttered. "Thornfield makes it his business to know everything about everyone who might interfere with his plans." "What plans?" Ezekiel asked. But even as he spoke, understanding began to dawn. The timing of Thornfield's arrival, his knowledge of the property, sale, his apparent familiarity with Caleb's identity, this wasn't coincidence. "The kind of plans," Caleb said grimly, "that involve a lot more gold than what you found in that box." The standoff continued for several tense minutes, with only the sound of rain and the crackling fire breaking the silence. Finally, Thornfield spoke again, his voice carrying the practiced patience of a man who'd negotiated many such situations. "I'm going to step onto the porch now," he announced. "I'm unarmed, and I'm hoping we can resolve this matter without any unpleasantness." Caleb kept his rifle trained on the door, while Ezekiel moved to get a better view through the side window. Thornfield was indeed alone on the porch. though the lantern light in the surrounding trees confirmed his men were still positioned in a loose circle around the cabin. "Say your piece," Caleb called through the door. "I represent certain business interests that have legitimate claims to property and assets connected to this land," Thornfield began. "I believe Mr. Yoder purchased this cabin without full knowledge of its legal complications." "What kind of complications?" Ezekiel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The kind that arise when stolen property changes hands multiple times over several decades. The kind that can only be resolved through proper legal channels or through reasonable private agreements between interested parties." Rebecca moved closer to Ezekiel. "He's talking about the gold, isn't he?" Before either man could answer, she stepped toward the door. "Mr. Thornfield, I'm Rebecca Miller. My family has farmed this area for 3 generations. What exactly are you claiming, Miss Miller?" Thornfield's tone became noticeably warmer. "I knew your father, a good man, fair in all his dealings. I'm claiming nothing more than what's rightfully owed to my family for losses suffered during the troubled times of the 1870s. Caleb snorted. "Losses suffered by whom? Your grandfather was one of the crooked officials who embezzled from the territory treasury before the stagecoach robberies even began." "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Brennan. Do you have proof?" "More proof than you might expect. The exchange revealed layers of history that went far deeper than a simple tale of outlaw gold." Ezekiel began to understand that Henrik Brennan's letter might contain information that could expose corruption reaching back decades, corruption that certain people would kill to keep buried. "Perhaps," Thornfield continued, "we could discuss this more comfortably inside. I assure you, my intentions are purely business-oriented." "Your intentions," Caleb replied, "got my father killed." The admission hung in the air like the scent of gunpowder. Rebecca gasped softly, while Ezekiel felt the final pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Henrik Brennan hadn't died of consumption in lonely isolation. He'd been murdered. "That's a very serious charge," Thornfield said carefully. "Perhaps we should involve the local authorities in this discussion." "Sheriff Morrison would be very interested in this conversation," Rebecca agreed. "Why don't I ride to town and—" "I'm afraid that won't be possible just now," Thornfield interrupted. "The storm has made the roads quite treacherous, and my associates are positioned to ensure everyone's safety until this matter is resolved." The polite language couldn't hide the threat. They were trapped, surrounded by armed men who worked for someone with enough influence to operate outside the law. Ezekiel thought of Bishop Stoltzfus's warnings about the corrupting influence of worldly pursuits and realized the old man had been more right than he could have imagined. "What exactly do you want?" Ezekiel asked. "Simply to recover property that belongs to my family's estate. Mr. Brennan's father stole a considerable sum from my grandfather's stagecoach company. I'm prepared to offer generous compensation for information leading to its recovery. And if we don't have any information, then we'll search until we find what we're looking for. This property has many hiding places, and I have considerable time and resources at my disposal." Caleb caught Ezekiel's eye and nodded almost imperceptibly toward the loose floorboard. The message was clear. They needed to protect Henrik's secret at all costs. "There's something you should know," Rebecca said suddenly, surprising both men, "about this property's legal status." "Oh." When the county held the deed in trust, they conducted a survey to establish clear boundaries. What they found was that this cabin sits partially on land that was never properly ceded by the local native tribes. Any treasure found here might be subject to federal jurisdiction rather than state law. It was a clever improvisation, buying them time while introducing legal complications that might give Thornfield pause. The man was clearly intelligent enough to recognize when a simple intimidation had become a complex legal quagmire. "Interesting," Thornfield mused. "Of course, federal jurisdiction would only matter if the authorities knew about any discoveries. Sometimes it's better for all parties involved to handle matters privately. A new sound cut through the rain. The distant clip-clop of hoofbeats approaching at a steady pace. Someone else was coming, and from Thornfield's suddenly tense posture, it wasn't one of his men. "That'll be Sheriff Morrison," Caleb said with satisfaction. "I sent word before the storm hit that there might be trouble out here tonight." Through the window, they could see lantern light moving along the forest track, not the furtive movement of Thornfield's associates, but the steady approach of lawful authority. The sheriff's arrival changed everything, and they could hear Thornfield's men repositioning themselves in the darkness. "Well," Thornfield said with forced good humor, "it seems we'll have an opportunity to discuss this matter with proper legal oversight after all." But as Sheriff Morrison's voice called out through the storm, identifying himself and demanding explanations, Ezekiel realized this confrontation was far from over. Thornfield might retreat for now, but men like him didn't abandon pursuit of valuable prizes easily. Hidden in his canvas satchel, Henrik Brennan's letter contained secrets that could expose decades of corruption. In his pocket, 3 gold coins represented just a small portion of a fortune that could either save his struggling community or destroy everything he held dear. The storm outside was beginning to ease, but Ezekiel sensed that the real tempest was just beginning. As he watched Rebecca's determined face in the firelight and listened to Caleb's quiet preparations for whatever might come next, he understood that his quiet life of routine and solitude was over forever. The carpenter's plane in his hands, Henrik, Brennan's tool, passed down through generations of honest craftsmen, would need to build more than cabins in the days ahead. It would need to help construct a future worth having, assuming they survived to see one. Sheriff Morrison's weathered face appeared in the cabin doorway, rain dripping from his wide-brimmed hat as he surveyed the tense scene inside. His hand rested casually on his gun belt, but his eyes held the sharp awareness of a lawman who'd walked into more than he'd bargained for. "Well now," he said, stepping inside and shaking the water from his coat. "This is quite a gathering for such a stormy night, Mr. Thornfield. I have to say I'm surprised to see you out here with armed men surrounding a peaceful citizen's property." Thornfield's expression remained pleasant, but Ezekiel caught the flash of calculation in his eyes. "Sheriff Morrison, how good to see you. I was just discussing some legal matters with Mr. Yoder regarding his recent property purchase. Perhaps you could help clarify a few points about territorial law and recovered stolen goods?" "Happy to help," Morrison replied evenly. "But first, I'd like your men to step back from the cabin. No need for all this drama over a simple conversation." As Thornfield gave quiet orders to his hidden associates, Rebecca moved closer to the sheriff. "There's something you need to know about what we found here tonight." Morrison's eyebrows rose as he examined the contents of Henrik's metal box. The gold coins caught the firelight, and his expression grew increasingly serious as he read portions of the faded letter. When Caleb stepped forward to introduce himself, the sheriff's hand moved instinctively to his weapon. "Caleb Brennan," Morrison said slowly. "I'll be damned. Do you know how many people have wondered what happened to you and your father over the years?" "I know it wasn't enough," Caleb replied. "Otherwise, someone might have asked the right questions." "About who wanted us gone?" The sheriff's gaze shifted to Thornfield. "And what would those questions be?" "Questions about stagecoach routes, about which officials had advanced knowledge of gold shipments, about why certain robberies seemed to target specific cargo while leaving other valuables untouched." Thornfield's veneer of civility began to crack. "These are wild accusations from a man whose own family was involved in those very crimes." "My father was involved, yes," Caleb admitted, "but as a victim of manipulation by men who used desperate folks to do their dirty work, while they kept their hands clean and their reputations intact." Morrison held up a hand for silence. "Let me understand this situation. Mr. Yoder, you bought this property legally from the county?" "Yes, sir. Paid $50 in back taxes." "And you found this box hidden under the floorboards?" That's correct. Mr. Brennan, you're claiming your father left evidence of crimes committed decades ago? Evidence of crimes committed against him and others like him. Evidence that certain prominent families built their fortunes on theft and murder. The sheriff turned to Thornfield. And you're here because? Because stolen property doesn't become legitimate simply by being hidden for 20 years. My grandfather's stagecoach company lost considerable assets to Henrik Brennan and his associates. I have legal documents proving ownership of any recovered funds. Documents can be forged, Rebecca interjected, especially when they're the only proof of crimes that supposedly happened decades ago. Morrison studied the faces around him, clearly weighing competing claims and hidden agendas. This is a complex legal matter that's going to require careful investigation. For tonight, I suggest everyone returns to town while I secure this scene. I'm afraid that's not acceptable, Thornfield said, his mask of politeness finally slipping. Completely. There are significant assets at stake here, and I can't allow them to disappear while bureaucratic processes run their course. Are you threatening a law enforcement officer? I'm protecting my family's legitimate interests. Interests that certain people seem determined to steal through manipulation of legal technicalities. The tension in the cabin ratcheted higher as both men faced off. Ezekiel realized that Sheriff Morrison was one man against however many associates Thornfield had positioned outside. Even if the law was on their side, they might not live long enough for justice to prevail. That's when Rebecca stepped between them, her voice calm but carrying absolute authority. Mr. Thornfield, there's something else you should know about this property before you make any irreversible decisions. All eyes turned to her as she continued. My family has maintained detailed records of land ownership and transfers in this area for 3 generations. What we found in our research about this particular plot is quite interesting. She moved to her traveling bag and withdrew a folded document that looked official and properly aged. According to territorial surveys conducted in 1869, this cabin was built on land that was never legally purchased from its original native inhabitants. Under federal law, any structures or assets found here would be subject to tribal authority rather than state jurisdiction. Thornfield's eyes narrowed. I find it remarkably convenient that such a document would surface tonight. Convenient, perhaps, but legally binding nonetheless. The Susquehannock tribe maintains treaty rights to unceded territories, and federal courts have consistently upheld those rights in similar cases. It was a masterful bluff, delivered with such conviction that even Ezekiel almost believed it. Whether the document was genuine or carefully prepared beforehand didn't matter. It introduced enough legal complexity to make any quick resolution impossible. Morrison seized on the opportunity. Well, that changes things considerably. Federal jurisdiction means I need to contact territorial authorities before anyone touches anything else on this property. This is ridiculous, Thornfield snapped. You're all conspiring to steal what rightfully belongs. He stopped mid-sentence as a new sound reached them through the cabin walls. Hoofbeats again, but multiple horses this time, approaching at a gallop despite the muddy conditions. Through the windows, they could see torchlight moving through the trees, not lanterns, but proper burning torches that cut through the storm like beacons. Caleb moved to the window, his rifle ready. That's not more of Thornfield's men. Then who? Rebecca asked. Looks like half the Amish community, Morrison observed, peering through the glass. I count at least a dozen buggies. Ezekiel's heart sank as he recognized Bishop Stoltzfus leading the procession, his white beard visible even through the rain and darkness. Behind him came other community elders, their faces grim with purpose and determination. They've come to bring me home, Ezekiel said quietly. Or to stand with you, Rebecca corrected, squeezing his hand. Look at their faces, Ezekiel. This isn't an intervention, it's support. She was right. As the buggies formed a protective circle around the cabin, Ezekiel could see familiar faces emerging from the storm. Neighbors who'd shared barn raisings and harvest dinners, families who'd known him since childhood, men and women whose quiet strength had built a community that endured through good times and bad. Thornfield's associates melted back into the forest as the Amish families took positions around the cabin. Whatever his plans had been, they clearly hadn't included facing down an entire community of determined farmers who'd come to protect one of their own. Bishop Stoltzfus approached the cabin door, his voice carrying clearly through the storm. "Ezekiel Yoder, your friends and neighbors have come to see that you're safe." But even as relief washed over him, Ezekiel knew this confrontation was far from over. In his pocket, the 3 gold coins seemed to burn like coals, and in his satchel, Hendrik Brennan's letter waited to reveal secrets that powerful men would kill to suppress. The community had come to protect him, but he wasn't sure if even their combined strength would be enough for what lay ahead. The confrontation took an unexpected turn as Bishop Stoltzfus entered the cabin, his presence commanding immediate respect from everyone present. Water dripped from his dark coat as he surveyed the scene, the hidden box of gold, the tense faces, the weapons ready for use. "Sheriff Morrison," he said with a slight nod. "Mr. Thornfield." His acknowledgement of Thornfield suggested this wasn't their first meeting. "Bishop," Thornfield replied, his calculated charm returning. "I'm sure you're here to collect your wayward church member and return him to the safety of your community." "I'm here," Stoltzfus said quietly, "to ensure that justice is done according to God's will, not man's greed." The old bishop moved to the table where Henrik's box lay open, studying its contents with the careful attention of someone who understood their significance. When he lifted one of the gold coins, his weathered fingers traced its surface with recognition. "I remember these markings," he said, holding the coin to the firelight. 1873. The year the territorial treasury was robbed, just before the stagecoach. Attacks began. All eyes turned to him as he continued. "I was a young man then, working as a clerk for the territorial government. I helped catalog the stolen items when the investigation began. These coins, they weren't taken from innocent travelers, Mr. Thornfield. They were stolen from corrupt officials who had already embezzled them from the public treasury." Thornfield's face darkened. "That's an interesting story, Bishop, but hardly relevant to current legal matters." "Oh, but it is relevant," Stoltzfus replied, "because I also remember who led that investigation, and which prominent families suddenly found themselves with reduced influence when the truth started coming to light." Rebecca stepped forward. "Bishop, are you saying the gold was never legitimately owned by Mr. Thornfield's family? I'm saying that stolen money doesn't become legitimate property simply because it's stolen twice." He set the coin back in the box with deliberate care. "These coins represent public funds that belong to the people of this territory, not to private individuals who manipulated the system for their own benefit." Sheriff Morrison leaned forward. "Bishop, if you have knowledge of criminal activity, I need you to make an official statement." "I've been waiting 20 years to make that statement, Sheriff. The only question is whether the current legal system is any more honest than the territorial government was in the 1870s. Caleb moved closer to the group. "My father knew about the original theft. That's why he was recruited for the stagecoach robberies. They needed someone to take the blame while the real thieves kept their respectable positions." "Enough," Thornfield snapped, his composure finally breaking completely. "These are the ravings of criminals and religious fanatics. I have legal documentation proving my family's ownership claims." "Documentation prepared by whom?" Bishop Stoltzfus asked mildly. "The same legal firms that helped cover up the original crimes." The weight of revelation settled over the cabin like smoke from the fireplace. Ezekiel began to understand that Hendrik Brennan's letter contained more than just a confession. It held evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government and business. Outside, thunder still rolled across the hills, but the rain was beginning to ease. Through the windows, They could see the steady presence of the Amish families who'd formed a protective circle around the cabin. Their quiet strength served as a reminder that some things, faith, community, justice, were worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost. "There's more," Caleb said, reaching into his coat pocket. "Something my father left specifically for a moment like this." He withdrew a small silver compass, its surface tarnished but its needle still pointing. True. Unlike an ordinary compass, however, this one had markings around its edge that seemed to correspond to the symbols carved on the cabin walls. "Henrik wasn't just hiding gold," Caleb explained. "He was mapping its location. This compass doesn't point north, it points toward the main cache, the bulk of the stolen treasury funds that he recovered but never had a chance to return." Rebecca examined the compass more closely. "These markings, they're not random, are they?" "No. They correspond to landmarks visible from this cabin. My father spent his final years creating a code that would lead the right person to the treasure while keeping it hidden from those who'd misuse it." Ezekiel took the compass, feeling its weight in his palm. The needle swung slowly, settling on a bearing that pointed northeast toward the deeper forest. But more than its practical function, the compass seemed to represent something profound, moral, direction, in a world where greed and corruption had obscured the difference between right and wrong. "Mr. Thornfield," Sheriff Morrison said, his voice carrying new authority, "based on what I've heard tonight, I think you and your associates need to return to town while I conduct a proper investigation into these claims. And I think," Thornfield replied coldly, "that you're all making a very dangerous mistake." His words carried an unmistakable threat, but before anyone could respond, Bishop Stoltzfus stepped forward. "Mr. Thornfield, you're outnumbered by 40 honest farmers who've come to protect their neighbor. Your hired men might be skilled with weapons, but they're not prepared to face an entire community united in purpose." Through the cabin windows, they could indeed see more families arriving despite the storm. Word had somehow spread throughout the Amish settlement, and people were coming from miles around. What had begun as a simple property dispute was becoming something much larger, a confrontation between honest communities and the corrupting influence of unchecked greed. Thornfield seemed to recognize that the situation had shifted beyond his ability to control through intimidation. "This isn't over," he said, moving toward the door. "Legal authorities will sort this out properly, and when they do, everyone involved in stealing my family's property will face consequences." "Mr. Thornfield," Ezekiel called after him, "if Henrik Brennan's letter proves that your family's wealth came from embezzled public funds, what then?" The man paused at the threshold. "Then I suppose we'll discover just how far some people are willing to go to protect their version of the truth." After Thornfield and his men disappeared into the storm, the cabin felt both safer and more dangerous. They'd won the immediate confrontation, but they'd also made powerful enemies who wouldn't give up easily. Caleb closed Henrik's letter and returned it to the metal box. "My father wrote something else, something I haven't shared yet. He believed that whoever found his treasure would face a choice: keep it for personal gain, or use it to benefit the community that protected them." Rebecca moved to stand beside Ezekiel, her hand finding his. "And what choice will you make?" Looking around the cabin at faces illuminated by firelight, Bishop Stoltzfus with his quiet wisdom, Caleb with his burden of family secrets, Rebecca with her unwavering support. Ezekiel felt the weight of Henrik Brennan's compass in his palm, pointing toward more than just hidden gold. It pointed toward a future where doing right mattered more than personal benefit. "I think," he said slowly, "that Henrik Brennan knew exactly what kind of person would find his treasure, and I think he trusted that person to make the right choice." The compass needle held steady, pointing into the forest where greater challenges and greater opportunities for redemption waited in the darkness. 3 days later, as Ezekiel worked alone in the cabin during the quiet hours before dawn, His investigation of Henrik's hidden papers revealed secrets that changed everything he thought he understood about the past 20 years. The letter he'd found in the metal box was only the first of several documents Henrik Brennan had hidden throughout the cabin. Working methodically through loose floorboards, hollow wall spaces, and concealed compartments, Ezekiel had uncovered a collection of correspondence, journal entries, and official documents that painted a picture far more complex than simple. Theft and redemption. It was Rebecca who made the crucial discovery, arriving that morning with fresh bread and coffee to find Ezekiel surrounded by papers that covered every surface in the main room. "You've been here all night again," she observed, setting down her basket and surveying the organized chaos around him. "Look at this," he said, holding up a letter written in different handwriting than Henrik's usual careful script. "It's addressed to my dear brother Henrik, and signed, your devoted brother Thomas." Rebecca frowned as she read over his shoulder. But Henrik only had one son, Caleb. "Who's Thomas?" "That's what I thought too until I found this." Ezekiel showed her a family Bible, its pages yellow with age. On the family record page, written in faded ink, was listed Henrik Brennan, born 1835, County Cork, Ireland. Thomas Brennan, born 1837, County Cork, Ireland. Henrik had a younger brother. A brother who came to America 2 years after Henrik. A did, who worked for the territorial government and who helped orchestrate the very treasury theft that Henrik was later blamed for participating in. The implications hit Rebecca immediately. Thomas Brennan, TB. She looked up at Ezekiel with dawning understanding. Thomas McCreary, the store owner who's been so helpful with local history. Ezekiel nodded grimly. Henrik's own brother betrayed him, set him up to take the blame for crimes committed by corrupt officials, then changed his name and settled down to live a respectable life, while Henrik spent 20 years trying to make amends for someone else's sins. But that wasn't the most shocking discovery. As they continued reading through Henrik's correspondence, another truth emerged that shattered everything they'd believed about recent events. "Rebecca," Ezekiel said slowly, holding up a letter dated just 6 months earlier. "This is addressed to someone named my beloved granddaughter, and signed, your grandfather who loves you, Henrik, granddaughter." Rebecca took the letter with trembling hands. "But Caleb said he had no children." Her voice trailed off as she read the letter's opening lines. "My dearest Rebecca, I know that revealing the truth about our family connection will come as a shock, but I can no longer bear the burden of this secret alone." The letter fell from her hands as if it had caught fire. Ezekiel watched her face cycle through disbelief, confusion, and finally a kind of terrible understanding. "Your father," he said gently. "Your father wasn't just a neighbor who helped the Brennans with barn raising. He was married to Henrik's daughter, wasn't he?" Rebecca sank into one of the wooden chairs, her face pale. "My mother died when I was very young. My father always said she came from Ireland, that she had no family left there. I never questioned it because why? Would I?" Ezekiel found another document among Henrik's papers, a marriage certificate recording the union between Mary Brennan and Joseph Miller in 1851. Mary had been Henrik's daughter from his first marriage, the marriage that had ended when his wife died in Ireland before they came to America. "Henrik was your grandfather," Ezekiel said, "and Caleb is my uncle." Rebecca's voice was barely a whisper. "He knew. When he introduced himself to me, when he said he'd known my father when I was little, he knew exactly who I was." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their revelations. Through the cabin window, they saw Caleb riding up the forest track, but his usual cautious approach had been replaced by urgent haste. He dismounted quickly and burst through the cabin door without his customary knock. "We have to leave," he said without preamble. "Now, Thornfield's men are coming with federal warrants, and they're bringing enough firepower to take on a small army." "Warrants for what?" Ezekiel asked. "Theft of federal property, conspiracy to defraud the government, possession of stolen Goods. Thornfield's legal connections run deeper than we thought. Caleb's eyes fell on the papers scattered around the cabin. What's all this? Rebecca stood slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. Uncle Caleb, I think it's time you told us the whole truth about why you've been watching over me all these years. Caleb's face went rigid. Rebecca, I don't know what you mean. Don't lie to me anymore, she said firmly. I know Henrik was my grandfather. I know you're my father's brother-in-law. I know you've been living in these woods for 20 years, not because you were hiding from your father's enemies, but because you were protecting his granddaughter. For a long moment, Caleb stood frozen in the doorway. Then his shoulders sagged, as if a great weight had finally become too heavy to carry. Your grandfather made me promise, he said quietly. When he knew he was dying, when he realized Thornfield's family would never stop hunting for the treasure, he made me swear to watch over you, to make sure you were safe, even if it meant living like a ghost. And the story about Henrik dying alone of consumption. He died fighting off 3 of Thornfield's hired killers who'd tracked him to this cabin. I buried him in the woods behind the house, under the old oak tree where he said he wanted to rest near his daughter Mary. Ezekiel felt the pieces clicking into place. That's why you knew exactly where everything was hidden. That's why you've been living out here instead of claiming your inheritance. What inheritance could I claim? I was wanted for robbery, remember? And even if I could prove my innocence, taking Henrik's treasure would have put Rebecca in danger. Rebecca moved toward her uncle, her face softening with understanding. You sacrificed 20 years of your life to protect someone you barely knew. I knew you, Caleb corrected. I watched you grow up from a distance. I saw you become the kind of woman your grandfather and your mother would have been proud of. It was enough. The emotional reunion was interrupted by a new sound. Multiple horses approaching at a gallop, accompanied by the jingle of military harnesses and equipment. Through the windows, they could see a large group of armed men surrounding the cabin. Their movements coordinated and professional. Federal marshals, Caleb identified grimly. Thornfield must have convinced someone in Washington that we're dangerous criminals. But as the leader of the group approached the cabin, Ezekiel realized this wasn't a simple arrest operation. The man wore the uniform of a U.S. Army colonel, and his bearing suggested someone accustomed to dealing with serious threats to national security. This is Colonel James Hartford, United States Army, the man called through the door. I need to speak with Ezekiel Yoder and Caleb Brennan regarding matters of federal importance. Ezekiel exchanged glances with Caleb and Rebecca. This wasn't what they'd expected. Military involvement suggested the situation had escalated far beyond local law enforcement. We're unarmed, Ezekiel called back. We'll come out. Colonel Hartford was a man in his 50s with graying hair, and the weathered face of someone who'd spent years on frontier assignments. His uniform was crisp despite the long ride, and his eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who'd investigated many complex cases. Mr. Yoder, Mr. Brennan, he nodded to each man in turn, then touched his hat brim respectfully to Rebecca. Miss Miller, I apologize for the dramatic arrival, but we've received some very serious allegations about federal crimes connected to this property. From Marcus Thornfield, I assume, Caleb said, among others. But before we address those allegations, I need to ask you about something else entirely. Hartford's expression grew grave. 3 days ago, a telegraph message was received at Fort Carlisle claiming that evidence exists linking certain prominent families to treason during the territorial period. Treason? Rebecca asked. Collaboration with Confederate agents to destabilize territorial governments through theft and corruption. If such evidence exists, it would be a matter of the highest national security importance. Ezekiel felt Henrik's final letter burning like a coal in his coat pocket. The old man's writings had contained references to Southern sympathizers and Confederate gold, but he hadn't fully understood their significance until now. Colonel, Caleb said carefully, if such evidence did exist, what would happen to the people who found it? That would depend on their intentions. Those seeking to protect federal interests would be treated as patriots. Those seeking to suppress or profit from such information would be treated as traitors. The colonel's meaning was clear. They could be heroes or criminals, depending on what they did next. But before anyone could respond, the sound of additional riders approaching made everyone turn toward the forest. This time, it was Bishop Stoltzfus, accompanied by Sheriff Morrison and a group of Amish elders. They rode openly without weapons, but with the quiet determination that had carried their people through decades of persecution and hardship. "Colonel Hartford," Bishop Stoltzfus called out as he dismounted, "I believe you've received some misleading information about the nature of this situation." "Bishop Stoltzfus," Hartford replied with obvious respect, "I was told you might have relevant information about these claims." "Indeed I do. Information that will interest you greatly, particularly regarding Mr. Thornfield's family connections and their activities during the war years." The old bishop approached the group with steady confidence. "Colonel, I was present during the territorial investigations in the 1870s. I witnessed the cover-up of Confederate collaboration, and I know which families profited from selling information to enemy agents." Hartford's eyebrows rose. "Are you prepared to make formal statements about these matters?" "I am. But first, I need to show you something that will clarify the true nature of the treasure hidden on this property." Bishop Stoltzfus reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio that looked official and well-preserved. "These are copies of federal treasury records from the territorial period, documents I've kept safe for 20 years while waiting for the right moment to reveal them." As Hartford examined the documents, his expression grew increasingly serious. "These show systematic theft of federal funds, routed through Confederate networks. The amounts involved are substantial enough to have funded significant enemy operations," the bishop finished. "Operations that were only stopped when honest men like Henrik Brennan risked their lives to recover the stolen gold." Ezekiel finally understood the full scope of Henrik's sacrifice. The man hadn't just been seeking redemption for personal crimes. He'd been working as a federal agent, trying to recover money that had been used to support the Confederacy against his own government. "The treasure hidden on this property," the bishop continued, "represents federal funds recovered from Confederate agents and their collaborators. It belongs to the United States Treasury, and it should be returned there." "And Mr. Thornfield's claims," Hartford asked, "are an attempt to recover stolen Confederate gold for his own benefit. His grandfather was one of the primary collaborators, and his family has been hunting for this treasure ever since the war ended." The revelation hung in the air like morning mist. Everything they'd thought they understood about the situation had been turned upside down. Henrik Brennan wasn't just a reformed criminal. He was an unsung hero whose sacrifice had protected federal interests. And Thornfield wasn't just a greedy treasure hunter. He was potentially guilty of treason. Colonel Hartford closed the portfolio and looked around at the assembled group. "Based on this information, I'm prepared to offer federal protection to anyone willing to cooperate with the recovery of these stolen funds." "And if we refuse," Caleb asked, "then you'll be treated as accomplices to theft of federal property. But given what I've learned here today, I don't believe that will be necessary." Rebecca stepped forward. "Colonel, if this treasure is returned to the federal government, what happens to the communities that have suffered while it remained hidden?" It was a question that went to the heart of Henrik's final wishes. His letter had spoken of using the treasure to benefit those who'd been harmed by the original crimes, but federal law might not allow for such considerations. Hartford's expression softened slightly. "Miss Miller, the federal government has discretionary funds for compensating communities that have aided in national security operations. I can't make promises, but I can assure you that your cooperation won't go unrecognized." As the sun climbed higher above the forest canopy, Ezekiel realized that his simple purchase of an abandoned cabin had led to discoveries that could rewrite local history and expose crimes that reached into the highest levels of power. But more than that, it had brought together people whose combined strength might finally allow Henrik Brennan's spirit to rest in peace. The compass in his pocket still pointed northeast, toward the main treasure cache and toward a future where justice might finally prevail over corruption. But that future would require courage from all of them, and the willingness to see Henrik's mission through to its completion. The abandoned mine shaft lay 3 miles northeast of the cabin, hidden in a ravine so overgrown with brambles and fallen timber that it would have been invisible to casual travelers. Henrik's compass had led them true, its needle pointing steadily toward coordinates marked on the hand-drawn map he'd secreted inside the compass housing. Colonel Hartford studied the map by lantern light as dawn broke gray and cold over the Pennsylvania hills. Around them, federal agents and local volunteers prepared equipment for what might be the most significant treasure recovery in the territory's history. According to these markings, Hartford said, tracing the faded ink lines with his finger, your grandfather calculated that approximately $200,000 in federal gold and silver was hidden in this location. Rebecca knelt beside the mine entrance, her hand resting on timber supports that showed Henrik's careful craftsmanship. Even in hiding stolen treasure, the man had worked with the precision and integrity that marked all his projects. $200,000, she repeated softly. That's enough money to build schools and hospitals to help struggling families throughout the region. It's also enough to make certain people very desperate, Caleb observed, checking the loads in his rifle. Thornfield won't give up easily, especially now that he knows federal authorities are involved. Ezekiel examined the mine entrance more closely, noting the warning signs Henrik had carved into the support timber. Danger, unstable ground, he read aloud. Water table rising, limited air below 20 feet. Henrik knew this place was treacherous. Bishop Stoltzfus said, arriving with the dawn patrol of community volunteers. He chose it specifically because anyone trying to steal the treasure would face significant risks. Sheriff Morrison dismounted from his horse and joined the group around the mine entrance. My deputies report movement in the forest about 2 miles south of here. Looks like Thornfield's gathered quite a few men overnight. Colonel Hartford's expression grew grim. How many? Maybe 20, possibly more. They're armed and positioned like they're planning to intercept us on the way out. Then we need to work quickly and carefully, Hartford decided. Mr. Brennan, you know your father's methods best. What would he have done to protect the treasure? And from thieves? Caleb studied the map and compass together, noting details that others might miss. He would have created multiple entrances, probably connected by tunnels that could be collapsed if necessary. And he would have set up warning systems to alert him if anyone was approaching. Warning systems? Tripwires connected to bells, maybe rockfall triggers that would block passages. Henrik was a careful man who thought several steps ahead. As, if summoned by their discussion, the sound of distant bells began echoing from the forest. Faint but distinctly metallic chiming that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. That's not church bells, Bishop Stoltzfus observed. No, Caleb agreed grimly. That's Henrik's perimeter warning system. Someone's moving through the woods around us, triggering alarms he set 20 years ago. Colonel Hartford immediately began organizing defensive positions. Federal agents take the high ground. Local volunteers spread out along the ravine. Nobody goes into the mine until we know exactly what we're facing. But even as they prepared for confrontation, Ezekiel found himself drawn to the mine entrance. Henrik's map showed not just the location of the treasure, but detailed diagrams of the tunnel system, including notes about structural weaknesses and flooding risks. The man had literally risked his life to hide this wealth properly, and now they were about to risk theirs to recover it. Rebecca, he called softly, gesturing for her to join him away from the main group. There's something else on this map. Something Henrik wanted specifically for you. She moved closer as he pointed to a notation written in different ink, apparently added after the original map was completed. In Henrik's careful handwriting were the words, "For my beloved granddaughter, beneath the third support beam, a grandfather's final gift." "He left something extra for you," Ezekiel explained. "Something beyond the federal treasure." Before Rebecca could respond, the sound of approaching horses cut through the morning air. But these weren't the furtive movements of Thornfields. Men, these were the steady hoofbeats of people riding openly on the main forest road. Through the trees, they could see Thomas McCreary approaching with a small group of townspeople, including several members of the county government and what appeared to be a lawyer or judge in formal dress. "Well," Bishop Stoltzfus said quietly, "Henrik's brother has finally decided to make his play." McCreary rode directly to Colonel Hartford, dismounting with the confident air of someone who believed he held superior authority. "Colonel, I'm afraid there's been a serious misunderstanding about the nature of this operation." "Oh? And what misunderstanding would that be, Mr. McCreary?" "The misunderstanding about who has legal authority over any treasure found on this property." McCreary gestured to the formally dressed man beside him. "This is Judge Harrison from the Territorial Court in Harrisburg. He's brought proper legal documentation regarding ownership claims." Judge Harrison stepped forward, unrolling an official-looking document. "Colonel Hartford, while I appreciate the federal government's interest in this matter, territorial law is quite clear about treasure trove discoveries. Unless you can prove these items were stolen from federal property within the past 7 years, they fall under local jurisdiction." Hartford's jaw tightened. "Judge Harrison, we're dealing with evidence of treason and Confederate collaboration. That places this matter firmly under federal authority regardless of time limitations." "Evidence? Provided by whom?" McCreary interjected. "A dead outlaw and his criminal son, a religious fanatic who's held grudges for 20 years. I hardly think such sources qualify as reliable testimony." The legal maneuvering was buying time, but Ezekiel could see that it was also creating confusion and doubt. Federal authority might not be as clear-cut as Colonel Hartford had claimed, especially if local officials chose to challenge it. That's when Caleb stepped forward with information that changed everything. "Thomas," he said quietly, addressing McCreary directly, "Henrik left something specifically for this moment, something he knew you'd eventually come looking for." McCreary's confident expression flickered. "I don't know what you mean." "Of course you do, brother." The word hung in the air like a gunshot. Around them, townspeople began murmuring as the implications sank in. Thomas McCreary, the respected store owner and pillar of the community, was the brother of the notorious outlaw, Henrik Brennan. "Henrik left a full confession," Caleb continued, "detailing how you recruited him for the treasury theft, how you promised him it was just stealing from corrupt officials, how you set him up to take all the blame while you disappeared into respectability." Judge Harrison's expression grew troubled. "Mr. McCreary, if these allegations are true—" "They're lies," McCreary snapped, but his face had gone pale. "The desperate fabrications of criminals trying to escape justice." "Then you won't mind if we examine Henrik's final letter," Bishop Stoltzfus said, producing the document from his coat, "the letter that names you as the primary conspirator in Confederate collaboration during the war years." As the bishop began reading aloud from Henrik's confession, several things happened simultaneously. McCreary's hand moved toward the pistol concealed beneath his coat. Judge Harrison stepped backward, clearly recognizing that he'd been manipulated. And from the forest around them came the sound of men moving through underbrush. Thornfields, horses taking advantage of the distraction to position themselves for an attack. "Colonel," Sheriff Morrison called urgently, "we've got armed men moving in from 3 directions." Hartford immediately took command. "Federal agents, establish a perimeter. Local volunteers, take cover behind the mine works. Nobody shoots unless fired upon." But as they scrambled for defensive positions, Ezekiel realized that the real battle wasn't going to be fought with guns. It was going to be fought over the truth about Henrik Brennan's sacrifice and the justice that had been denied for 20 years. The mine entrance yawned before them like a mouthful of secrets, while armed enemies closed in from the forest. Henrik's treasure waited in the darkness below, along with evidence that could expose corruption, reaching back decades. "Rebecca," Ezekiel said, checking the loads in his father's old hunting rifle. "Whatever happens, we finish what your grandfather started." She nodded, her face set with determination that reminded him powerfully of the woman he'd fallen in love with. Together, together. As the first shots rang out from the forest and men began shouting commands in the growing dawn light, Ezekiel understood that the next few hours would determine not just who claimed Henrik's treasure, but whether justice and truth could finally prevail over corruption and greed. The compass in his pocket pointed steadily toward the mine, toward the darkness where a grandfather's love had hidden gifts for future generations, and toward a confrontation that had been 20 years in the making. The first shot shattered the morning silence, its echo rolling across the ravine like thunder. Ezekiel pressed himself against the rocky outcropping beside the mine entrance, his father's rifle ready as muzzle flashes erupted from the tree line 50 yards away. "Federal agents, return fire," Colonel Hartford shouted, his military training taking over as bullets whistled overhead. "Protect the civilians." Rebecca crouched beside Ezekiel, her face determined despite the chaos erupting around them. In her hands, she clutched the mining lantern they'd brought to explore the tunnels. Henrik's gift to his granddaughter would have to wait until they survived the battle above ground. Caleb had taken position behind a fallen log, his rifle picking targets with the calm precision of someone who'd survived many such confrontations. "They're trying to pin us down while another group circles behind us," he called over the gunfire. Bishop Stoltzfus knelt behind the stone foundation of an old mining building, his weathered hands steady as he reloaded Sheriff Morrison's spare revolver. For a man of peace, he showed remarkable competence with weapons when protecting his community became necessary. The attack came from 3 directions, just as Morrison had predicted. Thornfield's men emerged from concealment among the trees, their movements coordinated like professional soldiers rather than simple hired guns. These weren't local troublemakers. They were experienced fighters who'd done this kind of work before. "There," Rebecca pointed toward a flash of movement near the mine's secondary entrance. "Someone's trying to get into the tunnels from the other side." Through the smoke and confusion, Ezekiel could see Marcus Thornfield himself leading a small group toward the hidden entrance Caleb had mentioned. While his men created a distraction with the frontal assault, Thornfield was attempting to reach the treasure through Henrik's back door. "Colonel!" Ezekiel shouted. "They're flanking us through the mine system." Hartford turned from directing his agent's defensive fire. "How many entrances are there?" Caleb fired twice at movement in the trees before answering. "3 that I know of, but if they get into the tunnels, they could come up anywhere, or collapse the whole system and trap anyone inside." The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Thornfield's frontal assault was keeping the defenders pinned down, while his real objective, reaching the treasure first, proceeded through the mine tunnels. If they allowed him to succeed, 20 years of Henrik's planning and sacrifice would be for nothing. "I'm going in," Ezekiel decided, checking his ammunition. "Rebecca, you stay here where it's—" "No." Her voice cut through his words with absolute authority. "My grandfather left something for me in those tunnels. I'm not letting Thornfield destroy it." Before he could argue, she grabbed the mining lantern and started toward the main entrance. "Besides," she added over her shoulder, "you'll need someone who knows Henrik's marking system to navigate safely." Ezekiel had no choice but to follow her into the darkness, leaving the battle above ground to Colonel Hartford and the other defenders. As they descended the rough-hewn steps leading into the mine, the sounds of gunfire became muffled and distant, replaced by the drip of water and their own echoing footsteps. The tunnels were exactly as Henrik's map had indicated, carefully engineered. Passages that showed the skill of a master craftsman, even when working under desperate circumstances. Support beams were placed with mathematical precision, and the walls bore carved symbols that matched the compass markings. This way, Rebecca whispered, holding the lantern high as she followed the symbols toward the main treasure chamber. Henrik marked the safe routes with crosses, the dangerous ones with triangles. They moved as quietly as possible through the narrow passages, but the confined space made every footstep sound like a gunshot. Somewhere ahead of them, other lantern light flickered. Thornfield's group was already in the tunnels, probably following their own copy of Henrik's map. The first chamber they reached was smaller than expected, containing only a few wooden crates and some mining equipment. But Rebecca's lantern revealed something more important: fresh footprints in the sandy floor, leading deeper into the mine. They're ahead of us, Ezekiel observed. But they don't know about Henrik's traps, Rebecca replied, pointing to nearly invisible wires strung across the tunnel at ankle height. Grandfather was very careful about protecting his work. As if summoned by her words, a rumbling crash echoed through the tunnels from somewhere ahead, followed by shouts of alarm and anger. Thornfield's men had triggered one of Henrik's defensive mechanisms. Rockfall. Caleb's voice came from behind them as he appeared out of the darkness, his rifle ready. I circled around through the back entrance. Thornfield's trapped in the main chamber with about half his men. Trapped how? Ezekiel asked. Henrik designed collapsible sections that could seal off the treasure if thieves tried to steal it. Thornfield triggered the mechanism when his men tried to force their way through a blocked passage. The tactical advantage had suddenly shifted in their favor, but it came with a terrible cost. If the mine system was collapsing, they might all be trapped underground, defenders and attackers alike. Water began seeping through cracks in the tunnel walls as structural damage compromised Henrik's carefully planned drainage. The old man's warnings about flooding were proving prophetic. The water was ankle-deep and rising fast when they reached the main treasure chamber. Henrik's mining lantern cast dancing shadows on walls lined with wooden chests and metal strongboxes, the accumulated wealth that represented 20 years of careful planning and sacrifice. But the treasure wasn't alone in the chamber. Marcus Thornfield stood knee-deep in the flooding water, his expensive clothes ruined, and his face twisted with rage and desperation. 3 of his men flanked him, their weapons trained on the tunnel entrances, while a 4th worked frantically to pry open the largest of Henrik's strongboxes. "Mr. Yoder," Thornfield called out as Ezekiel, Rebecca, and Caleb emerged from the tunnel. "How convenient. You can help us resolve this situation quickly before we all drown in your grandfather's clever trap." The water level continued rising, fed by underground streams that Henrik's structural damage had diverted into the chamber. What had been designed as a protective mechanism was now threatening everyone equally. "There's no way out through the main tunnel," one of Thornfield's men reported. "The rockfall blocked it completely." "Then we'll have to use the emergency exits," Caleb said, consulting Henrik's map. "But they're narrow, and they won't accommodate much cargo." Thornfield's eyes glittered with desperate cunning. "Then we'll take what we can carry and leave the rest. A few £100 of gold is better than drowning for principle." "This treasure doesn't belong to you," Rebecca said firmly. "It belongs to the federal government and to the communities that suffered when it was stolen." "Noble sentiment, Miss Miller, but nobility won't save us if this chamber fills with water." Thornfield gestured to his men, who began loading the most portable valuables into canvas sacks. "Unless, of course, you'd prefer to discuss ownership rights while we're all underwater." The pragmatic reality was undeniable. The flooding was accelerating, and they had perhaps 10 minutes before the water reached dangerous levels. But accepting Thornfield's logic meant abandoning everything Henrik had worked for, everything he'd died to protect. That's when Rebecca made a discovery that changed everything. Following Henrik's map to the 3rd support beam, she found the personal cash he'd left specifically for his granddaughter. Unlike the federal treasure, this was a smaller collection wrapped in oiled leather and secured in a waterproof metal box. Inside were gold coins, certainly, but also something more precious. Letters Henrik had written to the granddaughter he'd never been able to acknowledge publicly, Photographs of the daughter he'd lost and detailed records of every family he'd helped with returned stolen money over the years. "Listen to this," Rebecca said, reading from one of Henrik's letters by Lantern Light. "I have spent 20 years learning that redemption isn't found in grand gestures, but in daily choices to do right, regardless of personal cost. The treasure I leave for you isn't gold. It's the knowledge that doing right matters more than being safe." Thornfield scoffed, but his men had stopped loading treasure to listen. There was something in Rebecca's voice, in the simple truth of her grandfather's words, that commanded attention even in their desperate circumstances. "He wrote instructions," she continued, "specific directions for how this treasure should be distributed. Money for schools and hospitals, funds for families whose breadwinners were killed during the robberies, compensation for communities that suffered while justice was delayed." The water was now waist-deep, but the immediate crisis had created an unexpected moment of clarity. They could either fight over gold while they drowned, or they could work together to honor the sacrifice of a man who'd spent his final years trying to make amends for his mistakes. "There's enough here for everyone to benefit," Caleb added, his voice carrying across the flooded chamber. "But only if we stop fighting each other and start working together." Colonel Hartford's voice echoed from the tunnel entrance as he and his men arrived, having fought their way through Thornfield's remaining forces. "The situation above ground is secure, but we need to evacuate this chamber immediately. The water level is approaching critical." What followed was organized chaos as federal agents, local volunteers, and even Thornfield's men worked together to salvage what they could before the mine flooded completely. Henrik's careful planning had included waterproof containers for the most important documents and emergency evacuation routes for exactly this scenario. As they formed human chains to pass treasure chests through the narrow emergency tunnels, Ezekiel found himself working alongside men who'd been shooting at him an hour earlier. Crisis had a way of clarifying priorities. Survival and justice mattered more than individual greed. The community quilt that the Amish women had been sewing for the past month became the symbol of their success. When they finally emerged from the flooded mine into daylight, Bishop Stoltzfus wrapped the wet and exhausted survivors in the quilt's warmth, its patterns representing the unity that had made their victory possible. Thornfield, his expensive clothes ruined and his plans thoroughly defeated, sat quietly as federal agents placed him under arrest. But his expression wasn't one of anger anymore. It was something closer to resignation, as if he'd finally understood that some battles aren't worth fighting. The treasure was saved, the corrupt conspiracy exposed, and Henrik Brennan's 20-year quest for redemption finally completed. But most importantly, the community had proven that working together could overcome any challenge, no matter how overwhelming it seemed. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of the restored Brennan cabin as Rebecca carefully arranged fresh flowers from her garden in the vase that had belonged to Henrik's daughter Mary. The cabin had been transformed from a rotting relic into a warm, welcoming home, but its transformation was nothing compared to the changes that had swept through the entire community. Ezekiel emerged from the small workshop he'd built behind the cabin, wood shavings clinging to his dark shirt and the satisfied expression of honest labor brightening his face. In his hands, he carried a new family Bible, not a replacement for the leather-bound volume that still held Sarah's pressed flowers, but a gift from the community to mark new beginnings. "The school foundation is finished," he announced, setting the Bible on the table where Henrik's treasure box had once revealed its secrets. "Bishop Stoltzfus says they'll be ready to welcome students by autumn." Rebecca smiled as she watched. Children playing in the meadow beyond the cabin, their laughter echoing through the trees where Thornfield's men had once lurked with violent intentions. The Brennan Community School would serve both Amish and English families, funded by the federal government's reward for recovering stolen treasury funds. And the medical clinic? Construction starts next week. Dr. Harrison says it will be the most modern facility in 3 counties. Ezekiel moved to stand behind her chair, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. Your grandfather would be proud of what his sacrifice has accomplished. Through the open door they could see the steady stream of visitors who'd come to pay their respects at Henrik Brennan's properly marked grave. Colonel Hartford had ensured that the federal government recognized Henrik as a patriot who died in service to his country, and his headstone now bore the inscription, Henrik Brennan, husband, father, craftsman, and defender of justice. Caleb approached from the cemetery, his step lighter than it had been during the decades of hiding and watching from the shadows. At 54, he was finally living under his own name again, respected as a community elder and the keeper of his father's memory. The territorial governor's representative will arrive this afternoon, he reported, settling into one of the chairs Henrik had crafted with his own hands. They want to discuss the final distribution of funds for community improvement projects. The federal treasure recovery had yielded more than $200,000, just as Henrik's calculations had predicted. But rather than disappearing into government coffers, the money had been designated for regional development under a special federal program that honored Henrik's wishes for community benefit. Any word from Thomas McCreary? Rebecca asked. Caleb's expression darkened slightly. He'll stand trial next month for treason and conspiracy. Judge Harrison says the evidence is overwhelming. Henrik's letters documented everything. The revelation of Thomas McCreary's true identity and his role in the Confederate collaboration had shocked the town, but it had also provided closure. For families who'd lost loved ones during the troubled years of the 1870s, justice, though delayed by decades, was finally being served. Sheriff Morrison rode up the lane, his horse's hooves crunching on the gravel that Ezekiel had spread to make the cabin more accessible to elderly visitors. The sheriff had been promoted to territorial marshal for his role in exposing the corruption network, but he'd chosen to remain in the community he'd served faithfully for years. "Afternoon, folks," Morrison called, dismounting with the careful movements of a man whose body bore the scars of the mine battle. "I have news from the federal investigators." He joined them in the cabin's main room, accepting Rebecca's offer of coffee and fresh bread. "Thornfield's organization was larger than we thought. Federal agents have arrested associates in 4 different states, and they've recovered evidence of criminal activity going back to the Civil War. And Marcus Thornfield himself, 20 years in federal prison, assuming he lives that long. Seems some of his former partners don't appreciate being exposed." Morrison's expression was grim but satisfied. Justice has a way of catching up with people eventually. As the afternoon sun slanted lower through the cabin windows, Rebecca opened the new family Bible to its dedication page. In careful script, she'd written, "For Henrik Brennan, who taught us that redemption comes through sacrifice, and for all who choose to do right, regardless of the cost." The evening brought the weekly community gathering that had become tradition since the treasure recovery. Amish and English families alike came to share meals, discuss community projects, and maintain the unity that had made their victory possible. Bishop Stoltzfus offered the blessing over their shared feast, his voice carrying the weight of wisdom, earned through decades of leading his people through challenges and changes. "We thank the Almighty for showing us that even the greatest wrongs can be made right when good people choose to work together." As darkness settled over the hills and families began hitching their horses for the journey home, Ezekiel and Rebecca stood together on the porch of their restored cabin. In the distance, lights twinkled in windows where communities prospered because of Henrik Brennan's long-delayed justice. "Do you think he knows?" Rebecca asked, her hand resting over the slight swell of her belly where their first child grew. "Do you think he knows what his treasure accomplished?" Ezekiel pulled her closer, feeling the peace that came from work completed and purpose fulfilled. "I think he knew from the beginning that the real treasure wasn't gold or silver. It was The chance for people to choose between greed and justice, between selfishness and community. In the cabin behind them, Henrik's compass sat on the mantel above the fireplace, its needle no longer pointing toward hidden treasure, but toward true north, a reminder that moral direction was more valuable than any material wealth. The community had chosen wisely, and Henrik Brennan's spirit could finally rest in peace. As they prepared for bed in the home that love and sacrifice had reclaimed from decay, Rebecca opened the new family Bible one final time. On the first page, she wrote a simple entry in the family record. Ezekiel Yoder and Rebecca Miller Yoder, married June 15th, in the presence of God and community. First child expected December 1876. Below that, in smaller script, she added, "Sometimes the greatest treasures are found by those the world overlooks. Sometimes a man's quiet faith leads him exactly where he needs to be." The words echoed the opening of their story, bringing their journey full circle from that autumn day when townsfolk had laughed at a simple Amish farmer's seemingly foolish purchase. But wisdom, they had learned, often looked like foolishness to those who valued profit over principle. Outside their window, the Pennsylvania hills rolled away into darkness, peaceful and secure under the protection of people who'd chosen to do right regardless of personal cost. In the cemetery beyond the meadow, Henrik Brennan slept beneath a stone that honored his sacrifice, his long quest for redemption finally complete. The treasure he'd hidden had been found not by those seeking personal gain, but by those willing to use it for the benefit of others. And in that choice, they discovered the truth that Henrik had learned in his final years, that real wealth lay not in gold or silver, but in the bonds between people who chose to stand together when darkness threatened. The cabin settled into nighttime quiet, its walls holding the warmth of a family beginning their life together, while outside, the community they'd helped to strengthen continued its peaceful watch over the land that had cost so much and given so much in return.